The crisis was getting worse and worse. The magic and perfection was fading. The smiles and laughter were slowly changing from frowns to sadness. The fairies, pixies, wizards, and genies were losing their powers. Some of them, along with all witches and black magic sorcerers and evil genies, were disappearing. The stars and the moon were losing their color. Terrible things were happening. One Friday, several men from one kingdom were eaten up by the lies that they were never meant to experience happily ever afters with the true loves of their lives. Instead, they met with other men and decided that they were better off having unnatural sexual bonds with them rather than just being friends. The acts were so shameful that some of the people reported that behavior to the kings and the queens. The people exploded into fiery rages. They knew that what those men were doing were wrong, and the anti-immorality task force was beyond their audacity to get rid of all of them. They brought as many catapults as possible, but they couldn't fit every one of those men onto them. To help out, the mer people brought their archery tools, tied their arrows to one side of the ropes, and tied the remaining men onto the other side of the ropes, ready to shoot them into the portals that led to the real world. This would have been a relief that the corrupt king would lose his power and that everything would return to normal. But the catapulted men bluffed, stating that it had begun. There was a dispute at the palace in one of the kingdoms one afternoon. The king, duke, and count were arguing over the fact that there were two common women in sexual bond and wanted to dance together at the ball and surprise the people, thinking it would be a good change. The count was convinced that there was nothing wrong with such practice, but the duke and the king were against it. The dispute got so heated that no decisions could be made because of how stubborn the count became. So the ball was cancelled. In another kingdom one day, a wedding reception was held in honor of the duke's daughter, who was forced to marry a rich husbandman against her will. The poor girl lashed out because many speeches the special guests of honor made were lies and excuses. A baron was convinced how right she was, and made plans to annul this so-called marriage. There were too many inexcusable arrangements that had been made for a play that was to take place at the village theater in one of the kingdoms. They race-swapped certain characters, whether they were major or minor, and allowed certain men, whether they were bearded or not bearded, to perform female characters. The audience was disgusted with how the play was arranged, and left in the middle of the performance and demanded a refund. Immediately. The night was a disaster. The performers went broke, and the theater went bankrupt. In one of the kingdoms in the underwater country one day, the Mer King's sons had a heated dispute with their father over the fact that they were invited to a party even though two mermaids had sexual bonds. The more they argued and argued, the more heated the mer princes reached the breaking point for physical violence. They grabbed their crystal balls and used its powers to injure so many mer people's fins. The king was fed up with their behavior, so he made them miss out on the party, which they were glad of. There was hardly anyone in attendance, and the party ended early. The anti-immorality task force gave up. The burden was too heavy. Things were off the scale, and most of the country feared for their lives. They couldn't go into town very often. Taxes were so high they nearly went broke. Genuine parties, festivals, and balls couldn't be planned because some people had chosen sexual impurity instead of romantic relationships. And their abominable parties and festivals filled the country with their poison. The servants of those who were cruel and jealous began to be rude to their mistresses and masters and backtalk them and would not take orders from them any more, which also forced the cruel and jealous mistresses and masters to give up their cruel ways and change. Marriages were forced, which led to annulment. Theater plays became disastrous. The fairies, pixies, wizards, and genies lost their powers and couldn't go anywhere without it, and they weren't able to help those in need. Unicorns and magic carpets couldn't fly like they used to anymore. The children couldn't play in the meadows and forests anymore, and neither could they pick flowers and talk with the animals. As for the nobles and royals, they couldn't bear to live their status and titles anymore. Others tried to force the immoralities the corrupt king had welcomed into the country, but many resisted. And there were so many immoralities that it couldn't be thrown out. And worst of all, many of the people and creatures from Mazaroma settled into Tassalasia and invited their customs into the country. So, the decision was made to leave Tassalasia, the once colorful and magical country, now a den of wokeness, bigotry, and something to walk away from the light of moralities. It was a matter of doing what was right. 8 knights of the entire country gathered all their belongings, such as clothing and furniture, and placed them into wagons and carriages. The peasants shut down their shops, the farmers gave up their farms, the nobles and royals and other high-class people renounced their status and their royal titles, and sold their chateaux and mansions. Even the royal families renounced their titles and abdicated from their thrones. The remaining 1/9 decided to stay behind because the corrupt king had poisoned their minds. When the majority that decided to leave had everything packed up, they journeyed through the portal that led to the real world. The mer people of the underwater country decided to leave too, but they had to give up their mermaid status and become humans. So the last of the fairies spent the last of their powers to give them legs. Once they were transformed, they went through the portal too. All that were banished to the Lesby Outlands were given the news about the mass exodus to the real world. Now they know that their actions would have made them no different than the corrupt king who turned Tassalasia upside down. They apologized for their evil and were given a pardon, and were invited to leave the unearthly world. A portal for them opened, and they journeyed to the real world as well. After traveling through the portal for several hours, they were divided into 10 groups, and each group found themselves in different parts of the world that welcomed them after they reached the end of the portal. The royal families and all the upper-class people gave away most of their wealth to the majority that needed it the most, and they used the share of the wealth to build temporary houses for them to live in. They regained their magical personality and enthusiasm, but found it very odd for how things in the real world worked, and had to find places there and ways to fit in. There were many changes they had to make. One was that the children needed to go to school. Their magical enthusiasm showed the popular kids to think less of themselves, and help the not-so-popular kids, shy, selfless, and lonely kids feel more loved, and it reduced school violence to an extremely low level. The second change was that the adults had to get jobs in order to earn their living, whether it was cleaning, or cooking food, or helping customers find what they were looking for. They also had to buy food at the supermarket, and had to buy clothing, furniture, and other personal accessories at shopping malls and department and retail stores. The entertainment methods besides plays were movies and TV shows. They found it odd that many theaters in the real world that presented movies had screens in front of the audience instead of a stage. They also found it odd that the films and shows were placed in a black box called a video cassette tape, and that it was to be rented out for several days or bought and owned. And they also found it odd that music was placed onto a large black disc called a vinyl record, or 2 other devices called a cassette or 8-track tape. The upper-class people joined corporations and became advisors to presidents and CEOs. With their help, and using their magical enthusiasm, the presidents and CEOs made better decisions, better progress, and better investments, brought the corporations down to size, and had lesser debts. The former kings and queens gathered together by a lake and used the last of their wealth to start a resort for out-of-town vacationers. And they would also tell stories about their former land, Tassalasia. And their new means of traveling was driving cars, using motorcycles and bicycles, and riding buses, trains, and airplanes to get from one place to another. Another change they had to get used to was hunting and fishing. Nothing came out of the animals' mouths except the noises they made. The carpets were just ordinary, and there were no flying unicorns. No color came from the stars except their white, clear colors, and the moon was clear white. There was nothing enchanting about the forests, meadows, waterfalls, rivers, lakes, and oceans. They also had to get used to cloudy days and rainy days, and even thunderstorms. Rain and snow came from the sky, and the sun didn't always shine as clear as they expected. Those that were single found true love and romance with the people of the real world. Those who were already married started a family in the real world, and their children inherited their magical personality and enthusiasm. Everybody lived happily ever after, and nobody ever dared to go back to Tassalasia to find out what became of it. They were too scared to do so. The end.
Me, the gay, and the entire feature canon stayed awake until the very end of the pastor's story. We applauded because it had a good plot and a valuable lesson. He said goodnight to us all as he, his daughter, and granddaughter were heading to the cottage where his father resided in, and we all went upstairs to get ready for bed. As Thanksgiving morning approached, we looked outside and saw that the ground was covered with snow. So we all got dressed and went downstairs to have breakfast and ate as fast as we could so we can go and make snowmen and go ice skating on the frozen lake. It was very odd to find that as we were about to put on our skates, we didn't find the ice as solid as we expected, and we thought we saw green sorceress light under the water. And we can also feel the power of happiness.